So thanks very much for that introduction, Tony. It's absolutely true. Newspapers, it's a huge resource. So an hour's talk really isn't going to do justice to it. But basically, if there's people here that are used to researching newspapers, I mean, there'll be a lot of familiar websites and references. For those that are new to searching newspapers, it's certainly going to add a huge dimension to your research. So hopefully there'll be something for everybody, as they say. So I'll really just run through, this slide is just letting you know what I'm going to talk about, because as I say, it's such a big resource, I kind of have to break it down into what I thought was the most relevant. So this is the first part of the talk, basically the information from newspapers. There's national news, local news, personal news, and visual images. Really, national news, I'm not going to mention it, apart from just to say it speaks for itself. It's not the subject of this talk. Visual images, again, I'm only mentioning it at the outset, but it is a huge area, and people sometimes forget that newspapers were the first port of call for an awful lot of people to see illustrations, cartoons, photographs. I mean, most people didn't have cameras until kind of the mid-20th century. So, as I say, I'm not going to look at these in detail, but just to be aware that they're all part of this newspaper sort of as a source. Local news, again, I'll touch on it, but there are a huge range of local newspaper titles, and they obviously provide details of the communities in which our ancestors lived. Huge amount of advertisements in the past, and that the newspapers, they took up an awful lot of space with the advertisements, and it's obviously useful if your ancestor owned a business. This is the area I'm going to deal with mostly for the hour's talk, personal news. Basically, where to find births, marriages and deaths information, and also obituaries and reports of deaths. So that's the first part of the talk, and really the second part is where to find this information. I've broken it into 4 categories: online, obviously paid to view databases, hard copy and microfilm, which are free, abstracts and transcripts, which are also free, and where to find free newspapers on the internet. And as I say, there's loads more other than what I talk about, but really I'm touching probably on the main ones. This is really just to give you an idea of the first newspaper. It's the mid-17th century. It was I think it was 4 sheets. Basically, it's covering national news. It's about the kind of Parliament of the day, and it covers like a period of time. It was in the typical kind of old script of the 17th century, but that would be what is considered to be the first sort of newspaper published in a wide area. Now, just to give you an idea, some of the oldest newspaper titles, not all these editions are available, but again, when you're looking online, you need to check the databases and see what hard copies are there. But basically, the Belfast newsletter is a fantastic resource. Okay, it says the Belfast newsletter, but it was almost a national newspaper kind of throughout the country. It's going from 1737 right through to 1938. Freeman's Journal, similarly long-lived, 1763 to 1924, when it merged with the Irish Independent. The Derry Journal, again early, 1772, and it went through various name changes. It was known as the London Derry Journal and the Donegal and Tyrone Advertiser at various stages through its development. Finn's Leinster Journal, again quite long-lived, or it's quite early really, it's sort of 50 years there, 1771 to 1828. Again, these are just examples of the earliest newspapers, but it's showing you the range throughout the country. You've got the Kerry Evening Post, 1813 to 1917, Connacht Telegraph, covering the West, 1830 to the current day, Drogheda, Argus and Leinster Journal, again right through the 19th century almost, Kerry Examiner, 1840 to 1856, and the Cork Examiner, obviously 1841, changed then to the Examiner in 1996. So you can see it's covering, the newspapers cover more or less the whole country. So just looking at the different periods when the newspapers were sort of getting going really, which is the 18th century, they're primarily reporting news items relevant to the wealthier classes. So gentry, professional classes and merchants. That's not really to be unexpected, but when printing became much more kind of commonplace throughout the country in the early to mid-19th century, newspapers were used primarily for births, marriages and deaths, obituaries, in memoriam notices, and advertisements became increasingly popular right throughout the 19th century. Births, marriages and deaths, which is obviously pre-1864, that's when the newspapers can be very, very useful as an alternate search to where parish records may not survive. So by the late 19th century, really into the early 20th century, there is an absolutely phenomenal increase in newspaper titles throughout the country. And there's widespread use of newspapers for births, marriages and deaths. Obviously, obituaries and reports of deaths and advertisements all come into that. So, unfortunately, as is the case with many sources, landless labourers, tenant farmers, sort of rural and the urban poor, they are not really featured in a lot of the newspaper reports. Births, marriages and deaths, increasingly they feature by the late 19th century, but it's the old adage, if your family are just not well off, they're not going to be placing a newspaper notice. But saying that, they can their name can get into the papers in some other way, like in memoriam notices, and obviously through kind of local news, sports even, which is a very good area that people don't really think about. If your ancestor played sports and if they had a slightly distinctive name, because sometimes first names aren't printed in sports results, they can be very useful. So with any newspaper and any research, you really have to think about the newspaper bias. Okay, newspapers provide a contemporary view of what's going on at the time, but it's like even when you read anything today, you have to consider who's writing it and who are they writing it for, because there is generally a bias in anything that is published. So you've got to find out who's the publisher. Do publishers have a particular agenda, political or other agenda? And over time, newspapers' agendas can change. So, like in this example, the Irish Press was founded by Eamon de Valera, first published in 1931 to promote basically Fianna Fáil, and it was to counteract the Irish Independent, which supported what turned into Fine Gael, and also as an opposition to the Irish Times, which was really started off as a Protestant nationalist newspaper, and then that changed slightly its bias as time went on. Interesting, the Derry Journal, which started in 1772, it was originally a Protestant conservative paper, but in 1829 it changed and became a nationalist newspaper. That depended on who bought over that newspaper. So things change and develop as the newspaper's ownership changes. So it's like newspapers today, do not believe everything you read, past or present. And I know I've only ever provided a story once or twice to a newspaper, and I was kind of shocked when I read what I supposedly had said, because journalists don't report. Maybe they interpret what they think you said, or they choose to interpret it differently. So you just have to kind of keep an open mind, which I think as genealogists we're all used to doing, because you cannot rely on one source for anything. And really, it's important that in newspapers, reports weren't always recorded immediately, so a certain amount of time might have passed. So, you know, stories do change and develop, and it's worth checking a number of sources and taking the results as an indication of what may have happened as opposed to a fact. So the downsides of researching newspapers, a big one is it's very time consuming. Obviously, with the advent of computers and good searchable databases, this aspect of newspaper research is getting easier. Generally speaking, newspapers don't have an index, so you really have to know what you're looking for. Obviously, you can browse, but that has its side effects really, because the last one there, it's very easy to get sidetracked. So you do have to kind of know what you're looking for. Reliability, as I mentioned, can be questionable. Oftentimes there's no author or author to the particular article sourced or given. So like you need to substantiate the information you find from other sources. Obviously news items were often copied from one paper to another, especially to and from overseas. So once a mistake gets into the written record, it's very easy for that mistake to carry on and be embedded as fact, which it may not be. The text can be difficult to read. A lot of the newspapers, they're quite poor quality print, and on the databases nowadays, they use optical character recognition, which is, see there, it's the acronym is OCR. Sometimes that doesn't work very well, so you have to kind of put in different search words that you're using, and you have to kind of really get to know the database that you're searching. As I say, it's very easy to get sidetracked. Their topics are endlessly interesting. I mean, it's all life is there in the newspaper, and a lot more was reported in the past than maybe would have been reported in the present day or in the last 20 or 30 years. So obviously you take these kind of negatives into account, but definitely if you stick at it, if you get to know the databases, there's a lot of very kind of rich rewards to sticking with the search. So just to begin with looking at birth notices, I mean they are particularly useful obviously for genealogical research, and of the three big life events, births, marriages and deaths, births unfortunately in newspapers, the notices, they're probably the least informative of the three, as I say, the life events. So generally they were only placed by the wealthier families, especially in the 18th and early 19th century. They usually provide fairly scant details of the family members, naming only the father and the gender of the child. Sometimes they don't even mention the wife or in the name of the child. And a lot of the times the parents' names, addresses, a lot of that extra information that we're after is excluded. So just to give an example, I took this from the Freeman's Journal, 1771. This was a notice of a birth some days ago at Castlemartyr, the Countess of Shannon, of a son and heir, to the great joy of that noble family. That's not much use to us. So, I mean, that's just, you know, an example at the extreme end, but there's no names, there's nothing. You have to kind of know exactly what you're looking for to even know that that might be the family you're searching. So, like, that's an example of the early birth notices. This is from the Irish Times, it's 1865, and you can see it's in a dedicated birth, marriage and death section in the newspaper. Again, actually I think I've transcribed it because it's an example. It's quite hard to read, and even on the database, you know, looking it up and increasing the scale of the text, it was still hard to read. So I just wrote it out for this purpose. So there are various names indicated. It's still not great for genealogical purposes. The child and mother's name, as I say, is often excluded. So just in these examples, February 26th, Burke, Mrs. Burke of Danesfield, Moycullen, County Galway, of a daughter. Limited. Again, the same, Dewar at Sandyman, the wife of J.H. Dewar. Slightly better, you've got the name or the initials of the husband, of a daughter. But again, you know, very limited. Hornage, at least an address is given in this instance. The wife of Thomas Hornage, of a son. And McGann, March 8 at Lurgan, Mrs. Frederick. Useful that you've got a name there, of a daughter. But you can see there, there's a little bit more information, but it's still quite limited. Going to almost a century in advance, this is the Irish Times, 1957. Generally by this stage, there's a big increase in the information noted. You've got mother's maiden names, occasionally the child's name. Again, you've got in some cases there's a time lapse between the date of birth and the date of publication. That could be because it's an overseas notice. Also births in nursing homes and sometimes hospitals are beginning to get much more popular as opposed to home births. So again, I've transcribed it because it's quite difficult to read. So you see here Adair, December 26, 1956, to Vera, maiden name given, Nee Macaulay, really useful. Hugh Adair, obviously the husband. The address, Belfast, a son. Very good information. Okay, the son's not named, but you've got the date of birth, and obviously you can check then with the civil registration. Barton, 1957, at Hatch Street Nursing Home, so obviously they're getting more popular. To Margaret and Christopher Barton, Streamstown, Baroffaly, the address is given, a son, and you've got the name. So that's, as I say, pretty useful. Byrne, January 24th, 1957, Rotunda Hospital, again, wife Jim Byrne, and the address. Clear, at the Lissew Nursing Home, to Geraldine Nee O'Reilly, which is useful, wife of Desmond, and the address is given. And then down here it's the same, but the boy's name, the son's name, is also given. So you can see by 1957, or basically by the mid-20th century, birth notices are extremely useful. Marriages are an improvement on births generally. They're more informative, as I say, than the birth notices, and they're moderately informative in comparison to death notices and obituaries. Basically, marriage notices were placed by a wider section of the community, so that obviously opens the net further for any search. These are the things that can be listed in a marriage notice. Obviously, the name of the bride and the groom, the father of the bride, occupation of the groom, sometimes a comment on the family status. Definitely, this is much more common in the 18th and early 19th century. A location where the marriage took place. The name of the officiating priest or the minister, which again can be useful if you don't know the religion of the people you're searching. And it wasn't just Church of Ireland people, like there's a lot of wealthy, sort of middle class, merchant Catholic families that would have placed notices. So there's probably more people that place marriage notices in the papers than you would think. This again is an early notice, it's 1780. It's not in a dedicated section, you can see it's just in country news here. Again, I've transcribed it because the text is difficult to read. It's from the Finn's Leinster Journal. So Waterford, March 17th. Last Saturday was married in Dublin, so again, it's not actually happening in the local area. Samuel Boyle of the City, Esquire, captain of the Independent Company No. 5, so you know his occupation, which is really useful. And he's married to the amiable and accomplished Miss Dolly Carew, daughter of Shapland Carew of Ballybarrel in the county of Wexford. Really useful information though. You've got their name, the father's name, and her place of origin, and the father's occupation, formerly a representative in Parliament of this city. So again, you know, that's a lot more information than on a birth notice, and it's, you know, it's pretty good for that period. And obviously these are probably well-off people, and they are establishment people, so that is the reason probably why they even placed it. So again, marriages now, this is going forwards a little bit. That's the Irish Times, 1862. Generally, the mother of the bride's name is not recorded. And just again, I picked this example because of the various things that these examples brought up. There was an overseas marriage, and like it just shows that there was a time delay for when the marriage notice was printed as opposed to the date of the marriage. And also just be aware of spellings. When you're actually putting in a search, like we spell Ballybay today with a Y, so if you keep putting in Ballybay and it doesn't pick up anything, the reason is it's Bally spelled with an I. Some newspaper databases will pick up that little difference, but others won't. So, you know, you can be really get stuck on a tiny little sort of glitch, just like that. So it's again, just to be aware when you're searching and you're not getting a result for something, just look around, just think of some other way to search. So again, I've just transcribed these, just a couple of notices in the last publication, which is 1862. So Leonard and Hadaway, January 21st, Castle Dermot Church, the Reverend Edward Norris, A.B., Mr. John Leonard, late of the Honorary East India Company's Horse Artillery Service, to Frances, eldest daughter of the late Mr. John Hadaway, Graney Cottage, Kildare. Pretty useful. We've got a lot of leads there to go on. Hutchison and Demest, October 24 at Sydney. Now, like, this is January, so if you know your relative married in around January sometime, or sorry, in October, don't just search those dates, just widen your search area, because this is what will come up, and obviously that's nearly 3 months later. So, married at Sydney, commanding John Hutchison, commanding HMS Survey Adelaide. Again, good leads as to the occupation. And married to Louise, daughter of the late Prosper Demest of Tirera and Sydney, New South Wales. So again, leads to go on. Smythe and Ross, January 23rd, in the Second Monaghan Presbyterian Church by the Reverend John Edgar of Ballybay. And again, that was just put in there. I just show that example because of that name search. It's really common that words and certain events are not spelt or phrased even the way we spell them or phrase them in recent times. So, as I say, pretty useful. and but not as useful as death notices. So these are where a lot of information is contained in a newspaper notice. As I say, they cover the widest range of social classes, and it's the most informative of the biographical notices. So they range basically from limited information, again in 18th century notices, where naming the deceased, the age and the place of death, to more extensive information in the 19th century and later. This is what can be included in a death notice: name, age, occupation or occupations of the deceased, the date, time and place of death, a comment on the social status of the deceased, like we've seen in the personal remark in the marriages, more so obviously in the 18th century, relationships of the deceased, the date, time, the place of burial, which again is very useful for tracking grave locations, death notices for deceased individuals abroad, which again is very useful. And be aware that death notices, as with births and marriages, they can be printed in different locations, in different publications. So it's not always on the first page of a newspaper or the last page. Like, you've got to kind of search through the paper if you're doing it on a browse situation, rather than just putting in a search item. So this again is an early example. This is from the Freeman's Journal, 1798. Died at his father's house, Great Ship Street, Master William Mackay, aged 18 years, a most promising youth, eminent for his years in literature, a scholar at Trinity College. 3 lines, fabulous information. You've got his name, you've got his age, you've got his address, and you've got his activity. All leads for where you can go and find more information. So, as I say, that's from the late 18th century, but short, but as I say, very informative. This is just an example of the front page of the Freeman's Journal. It's 1880, I think. And you can see over there, births, marriages and deaths. They're on the front page. Another 10 years, all the births, marriages and deaths notices might be on the last page or on the middle page. So you have to kind of keep looking and being aware of where you might find the information. This, as I say, is just the deaths notices there. That's from 1880. And again, I just transcribed a few that are of interest. There's significant genealogical information in both of these, and what's interesting as well is a lot of the notices, they might have American copies, American papers, please copy. So that's suggesting that there's relatives that would find this news of interest. So again, it's extending your search to other countries. So Beale, December 18th at number 11 Grattan Street, Dennis Beale, carpenter, aged 66, for upwards of 30 years in the employment of Messrs. Mead and Son. Funeral at 10 o'clock on this Monday morning. Really, really useful, 2 or 3 lines. Again, farmer, December 9th, after 21 hours of illness. Mr. Peter Joseph Farmer, manager of the Castle Bar Gasworks, aged 31 years, second and dearly loved son of James and Catherine Farmer, late of Prussia Street. He leaves a young wife and 8 little children to deplore the loss of the best of fathers. R.I.P. American and Australian papers, please copy. So you can see there's really, really good information. Name, occupation, age, and then the extended family. You know he's got 8 children. That leads your search on. And obviously American and Australian copies or papers, please copy. So that's sending out a message. There's probably family over there that need to be informed. So looking again just at obituaries and reports of deaths, these can be extremely useful as well as just the death notice. And it's more about the person. There's more discussion about the person's life, obviously, than the events of the person's death. So there is, as you can see there by the first item, a general custom of not speaking ill of the dead. So you have to be aware that individuals may not have been in real life as so glowingly portrayed in their death notice. If an individual obviously was well known in public life, an obituary or a report of the funeral is much more likely to have been in a newspaper, and much more likely to be in more than one newspaper. Obituaries definitely were popular in 19th and 20th century newspapers, and again the 18th century is much more common for the wealthier classes. So in memoriam notices, again, these are something that people can forget about. Sometimes when people didn't have a lot of money and the whole community would have known that somebody died, there wouldn't be a death notice. but there might have been an in memoriam notice, which is really basically a notice when after on a month's anniversary. It could be 6 months, it could be a year. So if you don't find a death notice, it's worth checking maybe 6 months in advance, or a year in advance, or as I say, a month in advance, just to spread the net a little bit wider. Newspapers reported on everything in the past, and coroners' records, their survival rate isn't great for Ireland, but newspapers covered these inquests with a great length, so it's really, really good if you have any inkling that your relative may have died in unusual circumstances. There might be a coroner's report, and then that would be covered in the newspaper. This is I just took an example of a family I was working on, and it's just to show you the different information that can be got about that person by looking in different newspapers. So this is the Irish Press in 1931, and it was just the late Mr. W. Butler. So this is October 29th. So it just says Mr. Walter Butler, FISC, which is a fellow I think at the Institute of Surveyors and Engineers, 1 Percy Place, his address obviously, Dublin, who died yesterday, had been for 40 years an employee of Dublin Corporation. He was chief building surveyor for a great portion of that period. Retiring 8 years ago, he became a partner with the late Mr. Frank Bergen, engineer. The late Mr. Butler was a native of Dundrum, County Tipperary. Useful, definitely useful information. But this is the same death notice in the Irish Independent, same date. Mr. Walter Butler, FISC, who died in Dublin, aged 79, was a native of Dundrum, County Tipperary. Up to 8 years ago, when he retired, he was chief building surveyor to the Dublin Corporation. He was closely identified with the CTS, which is the Catholic Truth Society, the Knights of St. Columban's, and the Companions of St. Patrick, and was also a director of the Dublin Greyhound Racing company in Harris Cross. So, like an interesting mix of his life interests. But again, great leads. So that, you know, it adds to the picture of the person. This is a report of the funeral, so it's not a death notice per se. So it's the funeral of Mr. Walter Butler, FISC, which is confirming the same person, late Chief Building Surveyor, Dublin Corporation, took place after a requiem mass at St. Mary's Church, Haddington Road, to Dean's Grange Cemetery. So there we have it, we know where he's buried. The chief mourners were Mrs. Butler, widow, John M. and Walter A. Butler, sons, Mrs. Eileen and Kathleen Butler, daughters, Miss Nora Josephine Butler, sister. So you got the whole family, just by, you know, one little entry in the newspapers. And again, looking further, a different entry. This is again a report of his funeral. So the interment of the late Mr. Walter Butler, again FISC, took place yesterday at Dean's Grange Cemetery, Dublin, after a requiem mass St. Mary's Church, Haddington Road. So it's naming the church, not just that the funeral took place. The chief mourners were again Miss C. Butler, widow, Eileen Kathleen, daughters, Jack and Tony's sons, Miss Noreen Josephine Butler, and then it continues, Mr. Con Ryan, Miss Annie Butler, and Miss Ray Ryan, cousins. So again, it's expanding the family, and you've also got other people who attended the funeral. So it depends what you're interested in, but there's obviously loads of leads to go on in that entry. So just leaving the births, marriages and deaths aside for the moment, just really to mention, as I say, I'm not going to concentrate on advertisements or the court of trial records, but it's definitely worth using the newspapers for these reasons. If your ancestor was involved, say, in a business, or, as I say, it's particularly useful for tracing ownership of an inn, because inns were subject to a licence, and those licences had to be printed in a newspaper. So each year a licence was issued, and so you can trace the ownership of that licence in the newspaper forward in time. It's very useful to combine a search of local trade directories and newspaper advertisements. I can't overestimate or emphasise how much of newspapers is taken up by advertisements. It's only when you start to actually kind of look at 8 pages of a newspaper, maybe a good 5.5 are advertisements. And they obviously provide a huge glimpse into the local life of a village or town. So it really opens up the kind of local history of your ancestor, and if you're looking to broaden any search, searching a newspaper for around the period you're interested in is a very good thing to do. I've mentioned before the court and trial records. They're usually very well covered in both national and local newspapers, and obviously depending on the prominence of the case, it will get into the national newspapers more often, so if the people are well known or if their case is particularly of interest. And as I say, if you identify a relative in the prison records, which are online, it's very useful that you can combine a search of the newspapers to get a trial date. So again, it's just putting two sources together to kind of widen your search. So again, that's just an example of the front page of The People, which 1872. And it's almost the whole front page is just covered in newspaper advertisements. A lot of these are about ships, and ships offering their services, and obviously the cost to travel to America and the time it would take and the different conditions and the different classes that you could travel in. So again, you know, you don't have to limit your search to the people, to names. It's actually to kind of think about what your ancestors were doing, and it's very useful, as I say, to find out about the ship and immigration records. So just moving on to the second part really of the talk is where to find all this information. As I say, there's hundreds of databases out there. I've picked the ones that I use the most and what I think are the most useful for basically genealogical research. So there's online pay-to-view databases. These are the four categories that we're going to look at. The first is online pay-to-view databases. Second is where to find hard copy and microfilm copies of newspapers, which are free. A lot of earlier genealogists have done a lot of work on abstracts and transcripts from newspapers. And these can be really, really useful because basically the genealogist in the past has done the hard work for us. So we just go and find what they have extracted from the newspaper. And then looking at where to get newspapers online for free. Just tips for searching online newspapers. You have to get to know the database you're using. You know, you can spend hours being frustrated by search options and whether to put in inverted commas or percentage marks. Every database has a different method. Most of them will give a kind of tutorial, and when you might think, oh, just skip the tutorial and go straight into looking for granny or whatever, go back to the tutorial. It's just time and time again, you're going to save an awful lot of time being frustrated and wondering what to do. You've got to learn how to use these databases. As I say, use a variety of spellings for names and place names. Burn, as an example, 10 different ways probably to spell Burn. I've put up 3 here. Ballybay, as I showed. There's loads of different ways to spell place names and surnames. And even for events, like we call it World War I. 60 years ago, they didn't call it World War I, they called it the Great War. So there's no point putting in World War I in a search, just as a general search, because that's going to bring up a limited amount of results. If you put in the Great War, that will bring up hundreds more. So again, when you're searching for something, think of 3 different ways of putting in your criteria. So again, generally speaking, to find an exact phrase or a name, you use inverted commas around the search term. So James Connolly, if you don't want to bring up every James or every Connolly, you've got to put in inverted commas. But as I say, some databases are easier to use than others, and a lot of them, they have their own little tweaks and nuances. And definitely search more than one newspaper for the same event. As you can see in that case with the butler, the death of Mr. Butler, different information, different newspapers. So they're the kind of tips to keep in mind when you're searching. Basically, where to find newspapers. There's no, which is typical in Ireland, there's no single comprehensive catalogue exists for all surviving newspapers. So I think we're used to that in Ireland. There's just one stop shop for everything. So there's a fantastic project as part of the National Library. It's called the News Plan Project, and that's where generally I'd recommend to start in any search of the newspapers. It provides a listing of all the extant Irish newspapers held in the National Library of Ireland, held in the British Library, held in public libraries, universities, archives and newspaper offices. It's brilliant. and it's an ongoing project. It's a project of the National Library of Ireland, and basically the aim of the project is to preserve newspapers through a microfilming programme that protects hard copy holdings while making the content available. So really, if a newspaper's been microfilmed, the National Library of Ireland will not give you the hard copy, they'll give you a microfilm copy, basically to preserve the original. So there's about 260 titles per year are held in the National Library of Ireland. So what it does is, basically the Newsplan project, it lists about 155 towns and cities, mostly in Ireland, but newspapers published in larger cities in the UK, America, Canada, Australia, Tasmania, basically anywhere where there was a lot of Irish people. So even Dublin newspapers, there's 58 pages with roughly 10 titles per page. So that's 580 titles of Dublin newspapers alone. There's Cork is pretty well served, 80 titles. Chicago, again, there'll be a lot of high Irish population at certain times in Chicago. So these are the papers that are accessible in the Newsplan project. Buenos Aires, Southern Cross, it was founded by an Irish priest, Patrick Joseph Dillon. So they have almost all those records, 1875 to 2006. And also there's 40 titles of newspapers published in New York. So I didn't want to go online because going online can be very difficult depending on internet access. So I just took examples and took a screenshot basically. So if you go on to the National Library website, which is just nli.ie, you go to newspaper database, which is there, click that. I just took this as an example. I took the town of Ballinrobe in County Mayo. I don't know what newspapers were from Ballinrobe, but this is the whole point, to find out. So I just put in Ballinrobe, published in any county, and where are the newspapers? So I just put in any library or repository. So that's all you have to do, and then the next result, I clicked on that, and it tells me that there's the Ballinrobe Chronicle and Mayo Advertiser, and it began publication in 1866. So I click on that, and then this is what it gives me. So it's telling me where I can find that newspaper. And you can do that for, as I say, anywhere in Ireland that's listed on that database. So you've got the holdings. This is digital, Irish Newspaper Archive, microfilm, which is in the National Library of Ireland, and then the hard copy, which will be in the National Library of Ireland. So that's, that is where you start, as far as I'm concerned, for any newspaper search. It's really, really good. And it's an easy database to use. So just moving on to the next one is where to find newspapers, which is basically pay-to-view databases. These are useful, but they're expensive. The first is the Irish News Archive. I'm sure a lot of people here probably know all about it. It's the largest online database of Irish newspapers at the moment, which is, I wrote that in the summer, so there might be a few titles added since then. They're adding titles all the time. There's 74 titles. It costs €178 per year, which is expensive if you're not using it all the time. You can pay by the month. I think you can pay by the day. Again, they change their conditions of joining every now and again. I mean, a lot of these things you can get a free trial or you can get a promotional deal. What's good to know is that that database is free in the National Library of Ireland to use on their computers, and it's also free, I think, in a lot of county libraries. So it's just worth, if you don't want to fork out £100, it's worth going into the libraries or getting to know your local library and seeing can you avail of it there. The irishtimes.com archive is extremely useful. I must say it's a lot easier to use than the Irish News Archive. The Irish News Archive is great, but it's a difficult database to use.
Very much so.
Yeah, yeah. And it's they seem to be doing a lot of maintenance so that it's actually not accessible quite a lot. I mean, you probably have experience of it. I've given this talk 3 times, and the first question after each talk is, how do you use the Irish News Archive properly? It's volatile, it's difficult, but some days it works and some days it doesn't. So unfortunately, they seem to be having long-term problems with their computer software. I don't really know what's going on there, but they kind of have cornered the market because they have so many of the Irish records. So it's good, but as I say, unless you're using newspapers all the time, you're probably better just to go into the library, go to your national library or your local library and see can you access it there for free. A lot of people don't realise, but the British Newspaper Archive, they hold an awful lot of Irish papers as well. It's a vast database. There's British newspapers, like there's over 1,000, 1,200 newspapers and news pamphlets. But there's also Irish titles. There's about 30 Irish titles, and some of them are not available on the Irish News Archive. So some of those, the Dublin Mercury, 1723 to 1770, it's a much easier database to use than the Irish News Archive. And again, you can get subscriptions that are relatively cheap. I think that they do offer quite a lot of free deals, even around Christmas or Patrick's Weekend. Just keep an eye out. It's a very good resource and I think people don't really think about. Ancestry.co.uk, which I'm sure everybody uses, or uses it sometimes. UK titles, but there's also a large selection of Irish, UK, Australian, New Zealand titles. And I mean, Ancestry is just one of those sites that you have to spend a lot of time searching to get the most out of. The card catalogue is fantastic in Ancestry, and there's up to 38-page listing of newspapers and periodicals in that. They have the Belfast newsletter, and they've also extracted births, marriages and deaths between 1738 and 1925. So instead of you searching the Belfast newsletter for various dates, they've done all that work, and they've just put in what they think was going to be useful for genealogists, which is births, marriages and deaths in that period. So like, you're saving an awful lot of time if you know that that's where your ancestor may have published a notice. FindMyPast.com, it's the same as more or less Ancestry. There's a range of Irish, British and worldwide newspapers. I just put in John Grenham's site here. He provides quite a good link to, when you're searching a certain area, and I don't know if people use his site, but it's part is paid and part is free. But he links where you can find certain sources to certain areas in the country. And that's very useful. It's a pointer to where to go and what newspapers to go for different parts of the country. He also provides very good kind of background information on newspapers. As I say, just give yourself time to learn how to use each database. It's frustrating, it's maddening, but it's worthwhile when you get there. So this is again just going on to the Irish News Archive website. This is their home page, and you'll see these are the national titles that they have: the Freeman's Journal, Belfast Journal, the Irish Examiner, Irish Farmers Journal, Irish Independent, Irish Press, Sunday Independent. They give you the dates, when they started, when they finish, but like everything else, you kind of got to read the small print. So that's the rest of the country kind of going down here. They give you the counties which are relevant, which is great, but they do say, please note there may be gaps in the above time periods. So, while it might look great here, the Westmeath Examiner going from 1882 to the current, like there might be 50 years missing. So you have to know that there's something missing before you kind of decide, well, there was nothing in that paper of use to me. So it's a bit like read the introduction stuff quite thoroughly before you get going. To give them their due, they do provide good information on each paper, and there's the Belfast, brief history of every single paper. And they also kind of mention down here the Belfast News, the newspaper's orientation, which again is useful because you've got to get to know why is the newspaper reporting in a certain way, about a certain event. So if you think, oh well, this is a nationalist newspaper, why are they reporting all this stuff? And then you realise, oh well, it's changed because the owner bought over the paper 30 years ago or so. So like, that's very good information to be aware of before you do any search. Just moving on to the next one, which is the hard copy and microfilm copies of newspapers. Where can you get those for free? As I say, this is not an exhaustive list. It's a huge area. So, as I say, the National Library of Ireland, that's where you start. The Newsplan database, and if there's hard copies or microfilm copies, that's where you go. Most county libraries, as I say, you check each library, the database, or you check the Newsplan database to find out what's available. For people who are interested in Dublin records, the Dublin City Library and Archive has a fantastic collection of newspapers, particularly for that Dublin area. They hold national and local papers, some dating to the 18th century. There's daily and weekly newspapers and a collection of Irish literary and political newspapers which appeared sporadically since 1900. I mean, sometimes papers lasted 2 years, sometimes a few weeks, sometimes obviously 20 years and longer. So there's 66 pages of Dublin newspapers alone. So it's really extensive, their collection. Obviously the British Library I've mentioned on the database, but they also hold hard copies of Irish publications. But the others obviously are easier to access. But as I say, the database, the computer database is good, but they also, as I say, hold the hard copies. This is how the Dublin City Archive, that's the home page on their listing. So you've got the title of the newspapers, and again you've got the information from the end date and what format it's in. So, you know, there's ways of checking exactly what you need before you even go there. Just moving to the next section, which is abstracts and transcripts, and where you can find these for free. This is really coattailing, I suppose, on the work of earlier genealogists, and they extracted what they thought would be useful for genealogy. And a lot of local history societies, they have collections of newspaper abstracts, and it's, you know, not just on births, marriages and deaths, they could be on certain areas of interest in local history. So Rosemary Folliott, a lot of people probably here know her name. She would be well known in this field. She did a lot of work on abstracts and transcripts. She has extracted biographical notices in newspapers, primarily relating to counties Cork and Kerry, and it's from newspapers from 1756 to 1827, so it's all those early periods, and there's a few from that even earlier period. She also has compiled an index to County Cork biographical materials covering almost, well, just over 100 years. She's extended her range here with biographical notices in newspapers from Limerick, Ennis, Clonmel and Waterford, 1758 to 1821. So if you know that's your area of interest, it's certainly worth research or looking at Rosemary Folliott's extracts. She's also done an index to the Raffo marriage licence bonds, 1710, 1755, 1817 to 1830. There's copies available in the National Library of Ireland, Dublin City Library and Archive in Pearse Street, and some, as I say, some of the county libraries also have some of her abstracts. These are the 2 volumes of her work that is used the most often. They're in this collection, which is called the Albert Casey. This is Albert Casey's work. He did similar work to Rosemary Folliott, and he produced this volume called O'Keefe, Cushman, the Sleaf Lucre and Upper Blackwater in Ireland. Complicated name, but basically they're Barrendy names. And he extracted information. These are the volumes of interest. Births, marriages and death notices from Cork, 1753 to 1774, 1782 to 84, and Kerry, 1828 to 1864. So, you know, quite wide dates. And again, volume 8 of his Albert Casey's work, Birth, Marriage and Deaths, 1781 to 1821. So, while it's useful and very good to know, a lot of them are not indexed, and they can be difficult to work with. But it probably will save you time searching yourself through the newspapers, but just to be warned, it doesn't come with a nice big index and just put in the names. You do have to work a little bit hard to get there. There's an online index to Casey's work on corkpastandpresent.ie, which is a very good website for the Cork area. Ros McCutcheon has done a lot of work on the Early Irish Marriage Index, and while her work really began by extracting information that she came across and other transcribers in the Registry of Deeds, going back from 1708, she decided at some point to include information from newspapers. So again, this is the Early Irish Birth Index, which is available. It's just a surname only search for the Irish Genealogical Research Society. For members, you can get full information, but if you're just want to visit the site and see is there anybody of interest there for you? You can get a free surname only search, and it's the same with the Irish Death Index. So they're good. You know, when you've exhausted all other possibilities, this is a good area to go to, particularly, as I say, for early information. Now, where to find newspapers online, free access. We've kind of covered quite a few of these already. The National Library of Ireland is the main one, and there you can get the Irish Times Index, as far as I know, for free on their computers. The Irish Newspaper Archive, which I've already mentioned, that's free on their databases. They also have a Times Literary Supplement, a digital archive, and it's a full text, searchable archives of articles and book reviews from the Times Literary Supplement from 1902 to 2007. There's a similar, that's really for kind of local history and for, you know, broadening out your kind of local history search. But similarly, the Times Digital Archive, 1785 to 2006, it's a fully searchable news, obituaries and advertisements database. It's actually quite easy to use, and that's a good, you know, as I say, starting point. So the National Library of Ireland really is the place to start. County libraries, I've mentioned it before. A lot of information is available in county libraries. You can check where the local library is, if it's not necessarily in Dublin or in this area, and you just put in librariesireland.ie, and that brings up a list of all the public libraries in Ireland. And a lot of the times they do list what resources they have. And also askaboutireland.ie, it provides a lot of information about public county libraries throughout the country. I'll just finish with this last site. I came across it when I was doing the talk, and it's really useful for American newspapers. It's just called chroniclingamerica.loc.gov, and it basically is providing historic American newspapers 1789 to 1925. So it's actually a really good website, very easy to use, and it's free. One other thing on that website is that it has a link to a US newspaper directory from 1690 to the present day, and it's really easy to use. It's not going to provide the newspapers for you, but it will tell you where they are. So I've mentioned here Cindy's List. I don't know if people are aware of it. It's basically a woman in America who obsessed with genealogy, and she has compiled lists after lists of where to go, and her own kind of databases, and it's huge. I mean, it's not just a personal file. It's really useful, again, for newspapers and lots of other things. You have to get used to her indexing system, but it's as I say, it's a port of call when you're kind of broadly across the sea to the other side of the country, or the other side of the ocean. So this is just the Chronicling America website. It does, you probably can't see it very well here, but it does provide access to some newspapers. But this is what I found of interest, the US newspaper directory. So basically, if you click in there and you put in any, actually I think it's the next slide here, yeah. Like if you put in like Texas, or you put in Wyoming or Chicago, that will bring up a list of every single paper that's printed in that city. So I'll leave it at that. So these people are kind of helped with the talk, so I'll finish on that note. Thanks very much.